The 15th of June 1942. Dawn mist drifted low over the steppe airfield outside Milerovo, its pale haze turning the scattered fuel drums and thin birch trees into silhouettes. The ground was damp from the night rain, and the soft wind carried the metallic scent of aviation gasoline mingling with the smoke from a field kitchen somewhere beyond the revetments. Mechanics moved slowly through the grey light, their boots pressing deep imprints into the mud as they worked around a line of Yak-1 fighters from the Soviet 434th IAP. Engines, still cold from the night, sat quiet beneath canvas covers that fluttered gently with the shifting breeze. The war had ground into its second summer, and the southern front remained tense, every morning beginning with the expectation of incoming Luftwaffe strikes. The Yak-1 pilots were young, some barely out of training, others hardened only by the last month's brutal attrition. Their commanders had been ordered to fly aggressive patrols across the Don Bend, where German armored columns were pushing eastward with increasing speed. Air support was stretched thin, and the 434th IAP had been tasked with intercepting any German reconnaissance that threatened the Soviet positions near the river crossings. Senior Lieutenant Pavel Zaitsev stood with his gloves tucked into his belt, gazing across the field at the subtle glow rising behind the clouds. His Yak-1 rested in a shallow earthen bay, the olive paint darkened by the night's moisture, the red star on its fuselage barely visible through the fog. He ran a hand along the wing's edge as a mechanic tightened the fasteners on the ammunition panel, the metallic clicks merging with the light patter of tools across the field. Pavel had flown the Yak for only a few months, yet he understood its strengths well enough: nimble at low altitude, predictable in handling, reliable in hard turns. But he also knew its weaknesses: slower climb rate, weaker acceleration, and the constant mechanical strain placed on the Klimov engine when pushed beyond its limit. The squadron commander, Captain Artyom Lebedev, walked briskly along the flight line, scanning the sky even though visibility was barely a kilometer. His face was drawn from exhaustion, the result of too many sorties and too few aircraft remaining operational. He paused beside Zaitsev, lowering his voice against the wind. "Report from the front sector," he said. "German reconnaissance is active near the river. Their fighters are patrolling earlier than usual. We're ordered to sweep north of the ridge. No deep pursuit." Zaitsev nodded. "Same altitude as yesterday." 2,000 meters, Lebedev replied. "Watch your spacing. They've been coming in from above the cloud line." There was no need to elaborate. Everyone knew what he meant. The Messerschmitt Bf 109F, fast climbing, well-armed, and expertly flown by Jagdgeschwader units that had steadily gained control of the skies across the southern front. Soviet command underestimated the discipline and tactical precision of German fighter wings during the early phase of the summer offensive. Reports of Yak-1 formations being scattered, or even destroyed outright, had begun to reach headquarters, often dismissed as exaggerated or improperly documented. But the pilots at Milerovo had already seen enough wreckage scattered across the fields to know the reports were real. Radio static crackled through the operations tent as weather officers relayed visibility conditions. The faint hum of a generator vibrated through the ground. Mechanics pulled away the chocks and signaled readiness. Pavel climbed into the cockpit, sliding into the worn leather seat, its surface still cool from the night. He adjusted the harness, checking the tension by reflex, then reached for the fuel pump lever. The cockpit smelled of oil, dust, and the lingering residue of burned high-octane fuel. Through the canopy glass, droplets of mist distorted the shapes of the neighboring aircraft. Engines began coughing to life one by one, each Yak unleashing a burst of thick grey smoke that drifted low before rising in a thin stream. The air vibrated as the Klimov engines settled into a steady rumble. Pavel pressed his headset against his ears to drown the low-frequency tremors. Static flickered again, followed by Lebedev's voice, calm but carrying the weight of unspoken concern. Formation 2, takeoff in sequence. Maintain 500 meters distance after climb. Report any contacts immediately. The squadron accelerated down the mud-coated strip, wheels slicing through shallow puddles that sprayed behind them. The Yak-1s rose gradually, their silhouettes melting into the thinning fog as they climbed toward the base of the cloud layer. Below, the field shrank into a patchwork of trenches, vehicles, and tents, quickly swallowed by the mist. Pavel kept his engine at a careful power setting, listening for fluctuations that might betray trouble. His breath formed faint clouds against the inside of the canopy, quickly fading as the aircraft stabilized at altitude. The morning sky cleared as they moved northward. The clouds formed a broken, shifting ceiling above them, their edges illuminated by the rising sun. The steppe stretched endlessly below, thin forests, dusty roads, and the faint outline of distant ridges. Their patrol line extended across the front, maintaining disciplined spacing as trained, though the war had taught them that discipline did not guarantee survival. At 2,000 meters, they leveled off. Pavel scanned the horizon through the slight vibration of the canopy glass. Nothing but distant haze. The radio remained silent except for periodic static. The Yak-1s drifted through the calm morning air, their engines producing a steady hum that felt deceptively peaceful. For a moment, it was possible to forget that the skies to the west had already consumed hundreds of aircraft in the past weeks. But then Pavel noticed a faint, distant gleam, something metallic, just above the cloud line ahead. He blinked, steadying his breathing, watching as the shape emerged only for a second before disappearing behind drifting vapor. He didn't call it out yet. Not until he could confirm. The morning was too quiet. And everyone knew that quiet skies in the summer of 1942 rarely remained quiet for long. The faint metallic glint lingered in Pavel's mind as the Yak-1 formation continued its steady northern sweep. The morning haze shifted gently across the sky, scattering beams of pale sunlight through the fractured cloud layer. Beneath the aircraft, the sprawling steppe rolled out in muted browns and greens, its emptiness broken only by the thin lines of roads and intermittent patches of trees. The wind buffeted the Yak's canopy with a soft, rhythmic pressure, and the engine's constant rumble filled the cockpit with a low mechanical vibration that made every subtle noise feel significant. Lebedev's voice broke the silence at last. All aircraft, tighten spacing. Report anomalies. Pavel inhaled slowly, keeping his eyes level with the horizon. The memory of the gleam above the clouds pressed against his thoughts. He scanned again, adjusting his position slightly to clear a strip of condensation forming along the canopy's edge. The sky looked empty. Nothing moved. But the sense of unease grew heavier, like the press of humidity before a summer storm. He keyed his transmitter. This is 2-1. Possible reflection above the cloud line, bearing 085. Not confirmed. Lebedev responded after a moment's pause. Acknowledged. Maintain course. Eyes forward. The Yak-1 formation drifted toward the eastern edge of the patrol sector, their silhouettes barely visible to one another against the slowly brightening sky. Above them, the cloud layer thickened into uneven clusters, some drifting low enough to cast soft shadows against the aircraft wings. The calm weather, ordinarily an asset, now felt like a shroud concealing threats in every direction. Far below, Soviet ground forces maneuvered to respond to German armored pushes toward the Don. Supply convoys moved under the cover of thin tree lines, while artillery positions constantly shifted to avoid Luftwaffe targeting. The Red Air Force had been tasked with protecting these vulnerable corridors, yet its resources were stretched so thin that entire regiments often covered what once required multiple divisions. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, maintained a relentless schedule of patrols, reconnaissance flights, and fighter sweeps aimed at breaking any Soviet attempt to consolidate air defense. Pavel tightened his grip on the control stick as the Yak crossed another boundary of warm rising air, the aircraft rocking slightly. The clouds above bulged downward in places, their grey edges trailing like torn fabric. He kept his gaze fixed ahead, watching for the faintest disruption in the smooth outline of the sky. The Yak-1 cockpit offered limited visibility to the rear, forcing each pilot to trust the man beside him, a trust that carried a fragile weight in the shifting dynamics of 1942 air combat. The radio crackled again, this time sharp and brief. A different voice, Lieutenant Kiriv, flying 2 positions behind Pavel. Movement above. Confirmed. Multiple shapes. Lebedev's reply came instantly. Altitude. 3,000 at least. Possibly higher. The entire formation instinctively tightened their turns, adjusting their angles to widen their field of vision. Pavel's pulse quickened as he pulled gently back on the stick, raising his nose just enough to peer above the broken clouds. The moment he cleared the top edge of a drifting cloud, he saw them. Dark silhouettes cruising effortlessly above the white expanse, their wings distinct even at distance, sleek, narrow, unmistakable. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 FS held their formation in disciplined precision, sunlight catching their canopies as they began a slow, shallow bank. Pavel exhaled through clenched teeth. They were not simply passing through. They were positioning. The German fighters began a gradual descent, using the cloud layer as cover. Their movement was subtle, almost casual, yet every pilot in the Soviet formation understood the intention. The 109s were angled for altitude dominance, preparing to dictate the engagement. It was a tactic the Luftwaffe had used daily: hit fast, strike from above, withdraw before the enemy could regain coherence. Lebedev's voice remained controlled, though its calm edge carried strain. All aircraft, defensive spread. Do not climb blindly. Keep eyes high. The Yak-1s adjusted, widening their spacing without losing cohesion. Their engines rose in pitch as the pilots increased power, maintaining level flight while watching for the inevitable break. The cloud shadows shifted dramatically as the 109s disappeared behind them again, using the cover to obscure their vector. Radio static flickered, followed by the faint background roar of another engine. Pavel felt a tightening across his shoulders, the tension settling like cold weight. The German fighters were close now, hidden, but close. Then came the first glimpse. A single Messerschmitt broke through the cloud in a sudden, almost surgical dive, its silhouette flashing with sunlight as its propeller tore the quiet sky into a rising howl. It streaked across the Yak-1 formation at sharp angle, not attacking yet, testing, measuring spacing, confirming positions. Behind it, two more aircraft emerged briefly before vanishing again into vapor. Lebedev's voice sharpened. Stay level. Hold altitude. Do not isolate. The cloud layer above boiled with subtle motion. Shadows flickered across its underside, each one signaling a dive waiting to happen. The Luftwaffe pilots operated with calculated patience, waiting for the perfect moment, a fracture in Soviet discipline, a gap in spacing, a vulnerable angle. Pavel pressed his shoulder harness tighter, adjusting his engine mixture, keeping his left thumb poised near the cannon trigger without lifting it. The wind buffeted harder now as the air thickened with turbulence from the descending German fighters. His breathing settled into slow, steady rhythm, but his pulse hammered beneath it. Another streak tore downward, this time closer, sharper, more aggressive. A thin burst of tracer rounds flashed past one of the forward Yak-1s, clipping the air inches from its wingtip. No hit. Not yet. It was a probe, a warning, a mark of control. Pavel's jaw locked. They're setting up for mass dive attack, he muttered to himself. And for the first time that morning, he understood fully what Soviet command had been fearing but unwilling to acknowledge. The Germans had no intention of engaging evenly. They were preparing to strike with precision, coordination, and overwhelming vertical advantage. Exactly the kind of assault that had wiped out entire Yak-1 flights in the weeks prior. The sky above them shifted again. And the moment the shadows converged, Pavel realized the full weight of what was coming. The real attack had not even begun. The cloud layer above fractured as the Messerschmitts committed to their attack. What had been faint shadows moments earlier sharpened into distinct shapes, dark, angular, descending with lethal purpose. The air around the Yak-1 formation vibrated with a sudden rise in engine noise, the aggressive whine of DB-601s pushing into steep dives. It was no longer reconnaissance or probing maneuvers. This was the strike. Lebedev's voice cut through the radio, firm but threaded with urgency. Break. Break now. Defensive pattern, maintain pairs. Pavel banked sharply left, pulling into a shallow climb to preserve some altitude while maintaining visual on the descending threats. The Yak-1 shuddered under the strain, its wings groaning as wind pressure surged along the spars. Through the cockpit glass, the sky erupted into motion, fighters twisting, sunlight flashing across canopies, vapor trails cutting through the broken clouds. The first 109 dove directly onto the tail of Lieutenant Kiriv. Its wings flickered with muzzle flashes as the German pilot unleashed a controlled burst. Tracers passed cleanly through the Yak's fuselage line, and for a second Pavel believed Kiriv had escaped. Then a thin ribbon of smoke streamed from the Yak's radiator. The aircraft rolled violently, veering downward in a tightening spiral. Kiriv's voice strained over the radio, fragmented by static. Engine hit. Losing coolant. Cannot. His transmission dissolved into a hiss as his Yak vanished into the cloud deck below. Pavel exhaled sharply, forcing his attention back to the sky above. More 109s were emerging from the cloud layer now, each dive coordinated with impeccable timing. They struck in staggered waves rather than a single mass assault, one pair diving, another climbing to reset, the rest circling just above the white ceiling, ready to descend again. It was disciplined, predatory, a pattern honed through months of combat. Two Yak-1s attempted to climb toward the cloud line, hoping to disrupt the Germans' perch. It was a fatal miscalculation. Before they even reached the lower edge, a pair of 109s dropped onto them like falling blades. Pavel watched helplessly as the first Yak took cannon fire across its nose, the engine erupting in a sharp burst of flame. The second aircraft tried to roll away, but the German wingman closed in with methodical precision. A burst of machine gun fire stitched across its wing. The Yak flipped inverted, trailing smoke as it plunged. Lebedev roared into the radio, "Stay low! Do not climb! Keep turning inside them!" The command was sound. The Yak-1's best chance for survival lay in tight horizontal maneuvers where its agility could offset the Germans' altitude and energy advantage. But the battlefield had already splintered. The orderly formation from minutes earlier had dissolved into a scattered cluster of aircraft fighting desperately to create space. Pavel pushed his Yak into a wide defensive turn just as a 109 screamed behind him, the shriek of its diving engine slicing through the sky. Instinct tightened his muscles. He slammed the stick left, diving slightly to bleed speed before snapping into a hard right brake. The Messerschmitt overshot, its shadow streaking across Pavel's canopy as it pulled upward to reset. The maneuver bought him seconds, nothing more. A burst of cannon fire erupted somewhere behind, echoing through the open sky. Another Yak spiraled downward, its wings sheared by a single 20mm impact. The debris glimmered briefly in the sunlight before falling into the haze below. Smoke trails crisscrossed the air like black threads, each marking a point where the Soviets had lost altitude, coherence, or both. Pavel scanned desperately, searching for Lebedev. He caught sight of him to the south, a Yak-1 locked in combat with a 109 at close quarters. Lebedev dove through a cloud bank, forcing the German to follow. Pavel tried to move toward them, but another Messerschmitt intercepted, approaching from high rear aspect. The angle was perfect for the German. Pavel reacted instantly, rolling into a steep dive and pushing the Yak to its limit. Wind roared against the canopy. The engine protested, warning of strain. He held the dive just long enough to throw off the attacker before leveling into dense air at lower altitude. The sky above him had become a disjointed ballet of smoke, metal, and sunlight. Every few seconds a fighter would burst from the clouds, tracking a Yak in a near-vertical line. The Germans attacked with a discipline that made the engagement feel less like a dogfight and more like a series of executions. Strike, climb, reform, strike again. The Soviets, deprived of altitude and reacting under enormous pressure, were forced into low-energy defensive spirals that only widened the Germans' advantage. Pavel caught a fleeting opportunity as a 109 rolled past in front of him, its pilot focused on a Yak ahead. He aligned his gun sight, adjusting for angle, but the German completed his firing pass and broke upward before Pavel could squeeze the trigger. The Yak he had targeted erupted into flames and immediately began to fall. Pavel tightened his jaw. He hadn't fired a single round. He hadn't even seen a German pilot hesitate. Static flared again through the radio. Lebedev's voice was strained, nearly drowned by background engine noise. All remaining aircraft, disengage east. Do not. The transmission cut short, replaced by the stuttering crackle of a damaged radio. Pavel scanned for him again. He saw only a pillar of dark smoke rising from the direction Lebedev had last flown. A sudden wind burst rocked Pavel's Yak, followed by a slicing shadow above. He banked sharply as another Messerschmitt dove past him, the scream of its engine tearing through the air. The 109 pulled upward again in a flawless arc, climbing back toward the cloud layer. Pavel fired a short burst after it, but the range was too great. The tracers faded long before they reached the target. The German fighters regrouped briefly above, their silhouettes barely visible through the bright haze. More shadows circled, preparing for another dive. The Yak-1 formation, once 10 aircraft strong, had been reduced to scattered remnants, 2 diving low toward the river, 1 limping west trailing smoke, and Pavel alone at mid-altitude, engine strained, fuel running low, lungs tight from the constant surge of adrenaline. The Messerschmitts repositioned with methodical patience. They were preparing to finish what they had started, like countless times before, across countless shattered Soviet formations. And for the first time since takeoff, Pavel felt the cold, clear understanding of how entire flights could vanish in seconds. The next dive was coming. And there was no formation left to protect.